Thank you so much for joining us. It's just a couple of seconds past 6 a.m. You're watching AM Live. My name is Zainab Ismail, and we'll be taking a look at what's been making headlines. We'll be having a look at the papers, the Daily Nation, the Standard, the Star, also the Business Daily. Some of those stories we've prepared for you. A couple of other stories that will be setting the base for our conversation this morning, and I will also be introducing my panelists in just a moment. But first, let's begin with those stories and we'll get to the matter of the fact. Azimio la Umoja leader Raila Odinga has announced phase 2 of protests in the country, which he says will now take place every Monday and Thursday beginning next week. Azimio la Umoja leaders have stated that 2 protesters were shot dead by police and will be going for individual responsibility and culpability against police officers, adding that they press charges against Nairobi County Police Boss Adamson Bungei, both locally and internationally.
24 hours after Monday's day-long political mayhem in the capital Nairobi and Kisumu, Azimio la Umoja leaders have emerged, declaring an upscale of their protests.
In the second phase of our protests, in response to public demand, we shall now hold protests every Monday and every Thursday beginning next week.
The Raila Odinga team has heaped blame on the police, accusing the service of being violent and inciting violence on protests meant to be peaceful, as they demanded immediate and unconditional release of all those arrested on Monday.
Many of the demonstrators got hurt, and at least 2 innocent Kenyans were killed in cold blood by the police.
Yeah, William Mayange, third-year student at Maseno University, was among those who were failed yesterday for no reasons at all, in cold blood. The excuse police wanapeana ni kwamba sijui alikuwa anataka kuvamia supermarket Maseno. This sounds familiar and unacceptable.
So far, we have a case to file individual charges against Mr. Adamson Bungei, the Nairobi police chief. Will press these charges locally and internationally.
When asked about the much-hyped Grand March to State House that failed and whether it is still on, Azimio says,
we are entitled to march to any government premises. Government means our premises, for which we fund with our taxes, to present our petitions.
That this struggle is just starting. We are not looking back, and we will not be intimidated. No retreat, no surrender.
The outfit has called for a boycott of 3 products in communication, banking, and media sectors. Duncan Haemba, NTV.
Well, the country is dusting itself from a heavy and high adrenaline anti-government protest. As the government works to stem down the uprising, some opposition leaders claim their security has been withdrawn. Also in the thick of things are business and security factors, with stakeholders decrying a loss of revenue, life and property as a result. The losses could rise as the Odinga camp now seeks to run around in protests twice a week. Here's Brian Obuya.
Riot police lobbed tear gas canisters to disperse demonstrators gathered for a day of action called by the opposition to protest the punishing cost of living. The William Ruto government appears to have taken a tough stance over the protests. In an attempt to hamper the operations of the opposition, some leaders now claim the government has withdrawn their security.
Maandamano yalikuwa ya amani hadi pale ambapo polisi waliingilia. Nitakupa mfano, sisi kama viongozi, maseneta na wabunge, tuliandamana kutoka hapa bunge kwenda kwenye jengo la KICC. Hatukuwa na hatia, hatukuwa na silaha, tulikuwa tunatembea tu, hata tuko na walinzi wetu, kwa sababu unajua walinzi wote tumepokonywa. Sasa ni nini kilifanya mimi nipigiwe tear gas jana? Ukiuliza.
Those who report to have had their security detail withdrawn include Minority Leader Opiyo Wandayi. Wandayi, alongside Kilifi Senator Stewart Matsayo and 2 other politicians, were arrested during the protests. On the day of the shutdown, many businesses in Nairobi were shut, with some employers asking their staff to operate from home. as the smell of tear gas hung in the air long after police left and the chants of Unga and Nja went quiet a student's life was cut short by police in Maseno. A mechanic shot in the line of duty is fighting for his life at Mbagathi Hospital. At least 24 police officers injured nationwide in Monday's anti-government protests. Majority of those officers injured were attacked on Outer Ring Road, where protesters and police engaged in a show of might and tricks. Police arrested a total of 238 protesters during the anti-government protests in Nairobi and Kisumu counties. In Nairobi alone, 10 police vehicles were reportedly damaged, 13 police officers injured. At the same time, a police pistol loaded with 15 bullets was lost during the chaos in Embakasi. As the Ruto administration struggles to quell the tension and uprising, the governor of Nairobi County, Johnson Sakaja, now seeks a truce between Odinga and Ruto.
So tumesema wale ambao wameonekana kinaga ubaga wakiharasi watu na wale ambao walikuwa wanachukua wanavunja vitu, wale ambao walikuwa wameharibu hiyo barabara railings, tumeona na tunafanya surveillance kupitia cameras, lazima watatajiwa kotini kwa sababu haifai kuwa hivyo.
Odinga has called for the protests against the skyrocketing cost of living and what he says is a stolen election last August. Brian Obuya, NTV.
Meanwhile, members of parliament from both Kenya Kwanza and Azimio coalition are now engaging in a blame game over who should take responsibility over Monday's protests. Opposition MPs insisting the protests were peaceful, while pro-government MPs say they will not allow the demonstrations to go on. Brian Mushiri has more.
Kenya Kwanza and Azimio leaders are now engaged in a war of words as they seek to apportion blame over Monday's demonstration.
We have said what Mr. Odinga is doing is only equivalent to what bandits in parts of North Rift and Northern Kenya are doing to the lives of innocent Kenyans. What they are doing is banditry with cattle rustling. Mr. Odinga is involved in a scheme of urban banditry, and he must be held to account. And sponsored by his principal sponsor, former President Uhuru Kenyatta.
Even as their Azimio counterparts claim the protests were largely peaceful, save for the provocation by police.
Maandamano yalikuwa ya amani hadi pale ambapo polisi waliingilia.
We want also to caution the police against engaging in arbitrary arrests of innocent Kenyans.
Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua also found himself in the crossfire, with Suna East Member of Parliament Junet Mohamed taking a major swipe at him.
Ile kitu nimegundua jana. Jamaa alisema ati mimi ni mtu ya maumau, waachia mimi huyo mtu. Ataendanga akienda namna hiyo, jamaa alienda kujificha huko Mombasa kwa hoteli. Anaangalia kwa TV ya Citizen na KTN na NTV. Wanaendelea namna gani? Sijaona mtoto wa maumau jana ndani ya town. Hapana tisha watu.
On their part, the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya coalition leaders continue to insist that the anti-government protests will go on until their demands are met by the government.
And we are very clear on them. You open the server, you involve all stakeholders in the reconstitution of the IEBC, correct, and you reduce the cost of living.
A matter that the Kenya Kwanza affiliate leaders say is geared towards self-interests.
We are different, our president is different, and we are not going to bed. There is no negotiation of any nature in regards to their selfish aids, and we are not going to be engaged in any discussion around Mukate Nusu.
Brian Mushiri, NTV, Nairobi.
Well, just a little away from what we witnessed on Monday, well, a recent research on the state of meat consumed in the country has revealed high levels of drug-resistant bacteria. The research conducted on various samples of beef and pork by the World Animal Protection showed that the continuous consumption of the meat may result to multiple drug resistance due to the high levels of antibiotics used by farmers while rearing the animals. Helen Aura has more on that.
Nyama, 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 nyama. Oh, so delicious, and quite the delicacy for many Kenyans. But that delicacy may soon alter the life of many if left unchecked. A study conducted by the Kenya Medical Research Institute in partnership with the World Animal Protection now indicates that meat sold in the country may be more harmful than beneficial.
We went to the 6 leading supermarkets in 2020. We collected pig, pork and chicken meat. We then sent them to Kenya Medical Research Institute because we are not a research organization. And working with the scientists at KEMRI, we were then able to, one, isolate organisms. And we'll say that in almost 90% of the samples, we isolated an organism, a bacteria in this case. And then what we then did with the bacteria was, one, to then identify the bacteria so that we know whether they are disease-causing organisms. And in this case, some of the bacteria were the normal ones, like E. coli, Escherichia coli, which is...
According to the findings of the 393 samples collected, 98.4% of pork and 96.6% of poultry were contaminated with high levels of bacteria. Among the 611 bacterial isolates recovered, 38.5% were multi-drug resistant. Patients infected with multi-drug resistant bacteria tend to have a worse treatment outcome when compared to those infected with the more susceptible organisms. This is because of the overexposure to the antibiotics from the foods they consume.
If we do not cater and use the antibiotics that we have properly, we then end up in a situation where we might have a challenge with treating normal human conditions. And for us as an organization, we are saying that it starts with how we handle our animals, how we manage the animals in production systems, how we ensure that they have enough food and water, how we ensure that the spaces they are living in or the houses they are living in are hygienically clean, well ventilated, and meet certain standards. How we ensure that the animal is vaccinated, because some of these diseases, it's easier to manage them easier and cheaper to manage it at animal levels than at human level.
So far, key of the antibiotics that have been marked to soon be drug resistant are tetracycline and penicillin, which are commonly used in the treatment of many ailments. Helen Aura, NTV.
And devastating climate impacts are hitting faster than expected as the world edges closer to reaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit in a little over a decade. This is according to United Nations report put together by more than 200 scientists from around the world. Temperature extremes seen in recent years have yielded destructive storms and flooding, crop wilting, heat waves and deadly droughts such as the one currently ravaging the Horn of Africa. The 6th assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also warns that while humanity has the tools to prevent a climate catastrophe, it is still not putting them to use. NMG's climate editor Zainab Wandati now explains why this report is key towards building a climate resilient future.
Droughts, flooding, extreme heat, a new norm in the world as the impacts of climate change show no mercy. As affected countries struggle to catch a breath, scientists warn that this impact will continue to hit faster and harder as the world inches closer to reaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit in a little over a decade.
Humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years. The rate of temperature rise in the last half-century is the highest in 2,000 years.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the 6th assessment report this Monday, the first major climate report since 2018, spelling out the devastation of climate change around the world and how human activities such as fossil fuel use and poor land use practices have pushed the world to a 1.1 degree warming. The role of fossil fuels in global warming is one that is often hotly contested as the developing world refuses to phase them out. Now the UN warns that a net zero future should not be debatable if this climate crisis is to be survived.
Every sector must be aligned with net zero by 2050 with clear plans, including interim targets to get there.
To give a number to that, it's almost half. It's between 40% and 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions required by 2030 to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius. So,
despite the grim future the report paints, the UN says this IPCC report is the blueprint the world needs to change its ways by not only investing in a carbon-free future, but also ecosystem-based adaptation. Currently, at least 170 countries have some kind of adaptation policies in place, but for many of these countries, especially those in the global south, implementation is yet to kick off.
This report is a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector and on every time frame. In short, our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once.
The findings of this report will form the basis of the discussions at the UN climate talks, COP28, in November. Zainab Wandati, NTV.
Thanks, Zainab. Now, Kenyans will have until the end of this month to submit comments on the plan to revise the debt ceiling from 10 trillion shillings to an anchor of 55% of the gross domestic product. The National Treasury has invited comments from the public to be submitted by March the 31st at 5 p.m. The proposal to revise Kenya's debt ceiling is in the budget policy statement tabled by the National Treasury and comes barely 2 years after the last revision from 9 trillion to 10 trillion shillings. Currently, Kenya's stock of public debt stands at 9.2 trillion shillings, just 800 billion shy of the prescribed ceiling, hence the need to revise the ceiling. In the financial year between July this year and June 2024, the government is planning to borrow 720 billion shillings. All right, that's what we had for you. A couple of those stories, of course, which will be forming the basis of our conversation this morning. And time to look at the paper. I'm not alone in studio, however. I am joined this morning by Irungu Horton, who's the Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. A very good morning. Karibu to the studio. We also do have Joshua Changwoni, who's the Executive Director, CRECO Kenya. That's the Constitution and Reform Education Consortium. A very good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. In just a while, we'll also be having Diana Gishengo, who's the National Coordinator, TISA Kenya. All right, so we're going to have a look at the paper before we get into our conversation this morning. This is what we have on the very front page of the Daily Nation. Raila steps up onslaught against Ruto. And you can see the two gentlemen there on the very front page of the Daily Nation. Now, there are a number of issues. Now, opposition leader Raila Odinga announcing mass action twice a week, even as he made a fresh demand for the reinstatement of the 4 independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission bosses who were forced out and accused police of brutality during Monday's protests. This is in page 4 of the Daily Nation. There you have, you get the full report here, and you can see some of the things that were said by the opposition leader, that's Azimio leader Raila Odinga, yesterday, including the fact that they now plan to hold the mass action, these demonstrations, twice a week. That's every Monday and every Thursday. Just very quickly, you know, this will be what we'll be having a discussion around much deeper. But Irungu, your reaction to now these new statements that have been made by the opposition with regard to the protests that we saw on Monday was quite some ugly scenes in some parts of the country. I want to get your reaction first. What do you make of this?
So I think, you know, Monday's disturbances really were within the, the call for the protests and to assemble and picket were within the constitutional principle or the constitutional article that allows for public picketing. Unfortunately, I think there was several decisions and some indecisiveness within the Ministry of Interior and within the National Police Service, whether to allow it to happen or not to happen. And I think the stage was set really for the violence with the arrest of the students on Saturday night, with the cat and mouse chase of the organizers of the demonstration around KICC. And what happened was that a demonstration that was really focused around KICC just took on this national dimension, with 6 counties being infected, and in many ways the police were not able to manage that situation. I think there has to be lessons that are learnt from Monday that would allow for the National Police Service to facilitate. Their role actually under the Constitution is to facilitate and protect protesters and the public from violence, and what we saw was just a lot of violence on Monday, and we just hope that the family of William Mayanga, the Maseno University student, can find some peace as they grieve for the loss of their son. But we can also commiserate with all those businesses that had their shops destroyed. Millions of shillings of destruction took place on Monday. And in many ways, as we move into the season of discontent, we have to manage protests a lot better.
All right. Let me hear from Joshua, your initial reaction to this.
Thank you very much, Zainab. The Constitution of Kenya 2010, which is the supreme law of the land and no one is above it, provides for any Kenyan desiring to send a message through civil disobedience, which is very positive in our democracy. And by the way, the Constitution does not require that you seek permission from the police in order to picket. The Public Order Act, is misinterpreted that you seek such permission from the police, but contrary to that, it requires that you notify them so that they provide security. And that needs to be affirmed in the implementation of the Constitution, because I think what we are seeing now in terms of pronouncements by the government is in the old constitutional order and not the 2010 Constitution. But it's very unfortunate that at this time of the 12 years of implementation of the 2010 Constitution, Kenyans still lose lives when they want to send a strong message of discontent on the affairs, on the public affairs of the country. But for me, I think Kenyans have a right to picket, send a message to the government, and we've just come from an election where various promises were made, and I think we will be revisiting that and explain properly what we feel is not going right for our country. But let me say that Kenya is at crossroads.
All right, Kenya at crossroads. Let me just move forward with the paper to see what else we have in the Daily Nation. And Ruto Rigathi Mudavadi gets 802 million for new cars. The budget allocation for the purchase of new cars for Kenya top 3 government offices has shot up 8 times in the latest changes to the spending plan that also benefited retired President Uhuru Kenyatta. The offices of President William Ruto, his deputy Rigathi Gachagua, and Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi have been allocated 802.2 million to buy motor vehicles in the current financial year. This is a significant increase from what has been allocated as Kenyans come to terms with a bloated government that has scuttled Kenya Kwanza's austerity measures. Just quickly, and the budget estimates for the financial year 2022-2023, now the 3 officers had been allocated 108 million through the office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary. Though the office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary had not been catered for. However, the exclusion of the Prime CS only cuts expenditure by about 10%, or is it 80 million shillings. The biggest beneficiary among the 3 is the Deputy President Gachagua, whose office was given 290.8 million for the vehicles, an increase of 200 million shillings from 90 million that had previously been allocated by former Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani. So this is another thing that is now quite making headlines out there. And also joining me in studio, Diana Gishengo, very good morning. Good to see you, National Coordinator, the Institute of Social Accountability. Karibu sana.
Asante sana.
Let me begin with you. So, you work around looking at how the government manages, especially resources. When you're looking at this 802 million shillings for new cars for just 3 state offices, what do you make of it?
Thanks, Zainab. And I think in the last week and this week, we've been treated to something that shows the austerity measures that the Kenya Kwanza government has communicated during the campaign period and immediately after taking office is a facade. It does not exist. The government is not being very deliberate about that. And I think it's good to find out the office of the Prime Secretary is a new office, but there was always a Cabinet Secretary. It's an institution like the Cabinet Secretary. The office of the President and the Deputy President was there. They were resourced. Okay? So are we looking at offloading the other cars that were there, then purchasing new ones? Then the shift shouldn't be that high. It is okay to resource the presidency and the key offices, but to be spending 802 million in just cars when we are still in the middle of a disaster and economic crisis, I don't think projects the best message to Kenyans who are looking up to government for confidence that they are keen on economic recovery and improving the quality of lives. And if you compound this with what has happened earlier with the Office of the Chief Administrative Secretaries, which again is being said to be a small political cost, surely human cost must be higher than all other costs.
All right, let me just move forward on the Daily Nation. Maxine's lawyer claims Assad was abusive to her. This is that story that focused on the rally driver Maxine Wahome, who is accused of murdering her boyfriend Assad Khan yesterday, told the court that she was in an abusive, violent and dehumanizing love affair. Wahome saying that Assad and his brother used to take her rally sponsorship funds as a result, and this is something that we'll continue to follow up on. The court ruled that Wahome will remain in custody until it receives a pre-trial report before it can set a date to determine her bail application. The case will be extended virtually on the 27th of March. And we have just taken a look at that report, and in a moment, let me just see what else we have on the Daily Nation. Okay. Sees Raila over chaos, Ruto allies tell the police. Allies of President William Ruto calling on the Inspector General of Police to arrest opposition leader Raila Odinga over the chaos and destruction of properties witnessed on Monday. Even as Azimio Party maintained their demonstration was peaceful until the police broke up protesters. Politicians in the rival Kenya Kwanza Alliance and Azimio la Umoja trading accusations over who should take responsibility for the chaos, with each side claiming innocence. The Kenya Kwanza team was led by the National Assembly Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah and his Senate counterpart Aaron Cheruiyot. And on the other hand, and we also had the members of parliament affiliated to the Azimio coalition. And Kenya Kwanza is now urging the Registrar of Political Parties to deduct the funds to Odinga's ODM party and give the money to Ruto's United Democratic Alliance party to cater for the losses that the latter party incurred after its offices were vandalized in the protest that we saw on Monday. I don't want us to have a discussion on this because we will be delving much deeper into that. A mother's heartbreak as son is shot dead by police. We actually have that report by Kokusa. I'll be getting to that in a moment as well. And finally, on the Daily Nation, businesses count losses day after Azimio protests. You have traders, transporters, hoteliers, and also other business operators who were yesterday counting their losses after the protests disrupted businesses on Monday. And their woes are bound to mount following a declaration that the demonstrations will now be held twice a week if no consensus is reached upon. Let me get to the Business Daily. Kenya Power blackouts hit 10 hours on aging lines. Kenya Power is taking more than 8 hours on average to connect its more than 9 million consumers back to the grid after a blackout. exposing itself to the risk of renewed compensation claims by businesses for financial losses. This is according to a new report by the sector regulator. Now, the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority data show that in November 2022 was the worst in nearly 2 years after outages lasted 10.63 hours on average, prompting households and factories to seek costlier alternatives. Still on the Business Daily, Raila product boycott calls amplify political risks for farms. A number of top business brands have been dragged into the murky political waters, with opposition leader Raila Odinga making new product boycott calls that mirror the 2017 mass action that hit farms hard. What does that mean for businesses? We'll be having a look at the cost and the implication of some of the statements. And also, the 7th Kenya tech startup goes under on lack of funding. That is Zumi, which is an e-commerce platform dealing with non-food commodities, shutting down after funding dried up, adding to the growing list of tech firms that have collapsed in recent months, hurting Kenya's dream of becoming Africa's Silicon Savannah. Finally, pension assets post muted growth amid weak markets. That's the pension industry assets under management grew at their slowest pace in 7 years in 2022 after an erosion in the value of equities, property and offshore investments in that period. On the East African, 40 million COVID vaccines are going to waste. I want to believe this is still yes, this is our publication that is between March 18th and March 24th. The doses that cost billions of dollars are expiring in stores across East Africa as apathy and logistical hitches impede distribution and administration. And also very interesting, you can see a picture there of Rwanda's President Kagame playing football. Kagame's game plan for 2024, he asks, why not me? This is about who's going to run for president in the election in Rwanda. Taifa Leo, it's all about the protest. Pressure, Ruto, Raila wazungumze. Is there going to be dialogue? That's what we'll be seeking. Wito wa kumtaka Rais William Ruto kufanya mazungumzo na upinzani umeshika kasi siku moja baada ya kinara wa Azimio Raila Odinga kuongoza maandamano yaliyokwamisha shughuli katika maeneo mbalimbali ya nchi mnamo Jumatatu. And finally, on the Standard, still focusing on the same issue, battle for the hustler's soul. Ruto's take, Azimio leaders are insincere and want to get to government through backdoor. He's willing to hold talks with anyone who has the interest of the nation at heart. And he says he has a plan that will lower the cost of living, but it does, but only needs time to implement that. On the other side, Raila's axe, cost of living, Azimio is pushing for the lowering of the cost of food. Electoral justice, they are fighting for the reconstitution of IBC, saying the president is acting unilaterally, and inclusive government. They say the president is promoting tribalism through appointments. So these are the three main key agenda that we have seen the opposition focus on when they were out in the streets on Monday. Now, I want us to take a look at that report by Oko Kusa I mentioned earlier, where Masani University students took to the streets on Tuesday morning to protest the death of their fellow student who was allegedly shot and killed by the police during the Azimio protest. The third-year learner, William Mayenga, was shot in the neck after police moved in to disperse demonstrations. Oko Kusa has more, then we'll get into our conversation. All right, so we're going to be having that report in a moment, but this is what we have on the Star as well. The inside secret push for Raila-Ruto dialogue. Hardliners get in the way and Odinga scales up his mass protest to twice a week, heightening anxiety across the country. And of course, the Star mentioning that Raila's Star boycott call is irresponsible. This is CEO of Kwako. Opposition leader Raila Odinga is asking Azimio supporters to boycott 3 products, Safaricom, Kenya Commercial Bank and Radio Africa, especially in the Star newspaper. He says the call is unfortunate, unjustified and irresponsible, especially Raila knows only too well the good governance and transparency in the management of public affairs, which he is fighting for. And also still in the Star, Kisii family demanding for justice on son that was shot dead during the protest. This is another family. This is the same family, sorry. The body of William Mayenga is at the Coptic Mission morgue in Luanda sub-county. We'll be having that report by Okukusa in a moment. And this splash on pages 4 and 5 on the Stars, this secret push for Raila Ruto talks as the standoff worsens. Luka Wishia, that reporter, talks about a multi-pronged initiative which has been launched to push President William Ruto and Azimio leader Raila Odinga to the negotiation table, is according to what they've established. However, the push for talks has been scuttled by hardliners, even as Raila scales up his mass protests to twice a week, heightening anxiety across the country. All right, I hope we've been able to get that report by Okukusa now.
The busy Kisumu-Busia road was once again a no-go zone for motorists on Tuesday morning. Reason: angry Maseno University students protesting the killing of one of their own by the name William Mayenga.
We were very peaceful. The comrades only turned violent after one of us was shot dead.
We want justice for our comrade William, and we will not allow anything like that. If there is no justice, no peace.
22-year-old William is said to have been felled by a police bullet during anti-government demonstrations staged by the students.
The boy who was shot dead was just somewhere around this place, 1 meter away from the school gate. So whatever the police officers are saying is very unacceptable.
A report released by police in Maseno over the incident claims that the demonstrators, who included students, invaded Maseno police line during the protests, prompting the officers to respond with live bullets, having ran out of tear gas canisters. Now, according to the same police report, the deceased was in the company of a group of protesters who looted a nearby supermarket and barricaded the busy Kisumu-Busia road. However, his colleagues at the university have a different version of what transpired.
Before William was killed, nothing was destroyed, nobody was injured until they killed William. That is when 1, 2, 3 things that they are reporting that happened.
That issue of looting only came after one of us was shot dead. Comrades, power! We are not going to allow!
William, a third-year student, was pronounced dead on arrival at the Coptic hospital, where we found his grief-stricken parents and relatives.
I've lost my child. How old? My son was born in 2002 May. He's a third year here. He was to finish his course next year. Now this is the kind of graduation they are bringing me to.
William's father, Joash Mayenga, was too distraught to utter a word. The shocking death coming barely hours after he spoke with his son on phone. Okukusa, NTV.
Mtoto wangu ona sasa.
It is the impact, the cost of the maandamano that we saw on Monday. Diana, as you were getting in, we were just getting our first reactions on exactly what happened on Monday. I want to get your also assessment of the whole, your reaction on everything that happened on Monday. We've seen that someone has died, many more were injured, a lot more, dozens have been arrested, and also according to police, they say about 24 officers were also injured in the clashes. What do you make of what we witnessed in some parts of the country?
Thank you, Zainab, and my condolences to the family of William Mayenga. It's very unfortunate that we have lost one of our youth in university who participated in the demonstrations on Monday. The Monday demonstration were definitely a way to continue as a country for us to practice and test our democracy and whether we can allow people to freely express and assemble. Unfortunately, I think the conduct of the police is not acceptable. in most of the instances. The media reported from morning instances of police using tear gas in around residential areas. It was not clear what crowds they were dispersing, and I think even before we go to the use of live bullet force, it is the use of tear gas, not as a crowd control mechanism, but as a deterrent and as a lethal weapon. There's one photo where a police officer shoots tear gas directly at people. Tear gas ought to be in the air to disperse people, not to target people. And it has been reported if used inappropriately, then it has serious health effects. And you saw in areas like Isili, even children fleeing for dear life and having to bear the pains of tear gas in that sense. And generally, I think the general planning of the demonstration was not very well managed, but ultimately the police response was not proportionate. It is unacceptable. We must always, when it comes to freedom of association and assembly, take all measures in favor and presumption of the right. If criminal activities arise, then proportionate action should be taken in that sense, but not just to deter a fundamental right and freedom.
And what we've suddenly seen is a lot of blame game between, the two members of the political sides, and also, the police getting a portion of that as well. When we come back, Irungu, Joshua, you'll be telling us, could this have been managed a little bit better, maybe differently? Let's take a very quick break here on AM Live. We'll be back in a very short while. The hashtag to use, as always, is AM Live and TV.
Allowed to have smartphones. Children should not have smartphones because they will cheat in the assessment.
Let's learn and have so much fun together.
Smelly shoes and socks, shock sisters. Smelly shoes and socks, shock sisters.
Smelly shoes is shock. Hey.
Fruity freshness in every sip.
But this week, COVID jabs go down the drain. East Africa countries stuck with millions of vaccines as curtains fall on pandemic war. Tanzania, Burundi under pressure to join EAC call network. Angola, Burundi deploy troops in restive Eastern DR Congo. Plus our opinion leaders. Kenya is yet to know it has lost its milk war with Uganda. Charles Onyango Obo. Samia opposition Dente is a yo-yo far better than war. Generali Ulimwengu. For every successful woman, there is a suffering little girl. Joachim Buembo. Magazine. Akaye Kerunen, Ugandan Olympic champion of the arts world. For this and more stories, get your copy of the East African.
Now this is what we call convergence. Come through for the morning fix this and every single Friday right here on MTV. Yes, it's about that time.
You know, the coolest thing about mornings is that a girl and two guys together in the mix, you never know what to expect. You guys are crazy.
From Friday 6, bring your good vibes, bring your picks. From 7 a.m., it's a dope mix. Every single thing on Friday changes with the morning fix.
With 14 titles, Real Madrid has won the Champions League more than any other team. Just as Carlo Ancelotti has won 4 Champions League crowns, more than any other manager. Together, Madrid and Ancelotti have won 2 Champions League titles in 2014 and 2022. Hoping and believing 2023 will bring even more success and history.
World of flavor, fruity freshness in every sip.
All right, welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. You're watching AM Live on NTV. In studio, I am with Irungu Hutton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, Diana Gishengo, the National Coordinator at the Institute of Social Accountability, as well as Joshua Changoni, who's Executive Director, CRECO Kenya, the Constitution and Reform Education Consortium. Now, we've just seen that report, a cry for justice from the family of William Mayengo, that 30 students from Maseno University. Irungu, the high level of chaos that we witnessed on Monday in some parts of Nairobi and also in Kisumu and some of the other counties as well. Heavy security presence, a lot of police force that was also in use. We saw tear gas canisters lobbed at protesters. We saw water cannon trucks, vandalism and looting also by the protesters as well. Now, there has been a lot of blame game over who should take the blame on exactly what happened. Could this have been handled better? Could this have been managed better? Because on the 19th of March, we had Raila Odinga coming out and saying, look, we are organizing a protest, not on 19th of March, that I believe, or it was about 2 weeks before that. And he said, on the 20th of March, we will be coming and we'll be protesting. If they were the organizers, then where does the blame fall?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to stop the blame game. It doesn't help us anymore. It may, it may give us opportunities to see what went wrong and which actions led to the violence that we saw on Monday, both by some of the protesters, but also some of the police. And again, just to mention that not all the police were violent. Right. There were certain cases where we did see de-escalation. But the important thing really is to think about this coming Monday, and if the leader of Azimio is going to carry through the promise of 2 days of strike, 2 days of protests, then Thursday as well. Yes. So I think there are 4 things that perhaps could be done right now. The first is, let us all reaffirm the right to assemble, the right to picket, the right to demonstrate. This is fundamentally embedded in our constitution. The question, of course, is how do you exercise that right? And I think there are a couple of things that could be looked at. First of all, it was very clear that there was no agreement, no working arrangement, perhaps not even a clarity about how the protest was going to be managed, where it was going to be located, both the routes that were going to be used. And I think once you have agreement on those very basic factors, it is possible to manage even a very large-scale protest. And we saw this in the South African context, where there was a deployment of the security, but in a manner in which the protest itself was not jeopardized or scattered. And therefore you saw the leader of the economic freedom fighters, Malema, speaking in Pretoria, and there was hardly any violence, and there were thousands of people in that space. So I think very quickly the National Police Service needs to reach out to the marshals on the Azimio side, make sure that they are marshals, identify who the organizers are, and essentially begin to start a plan for Monday and Thursday. The third area really is around independent observers. We have, fortunately, as a result of the same constitution, we have a number of agencies whose responsibility it is to remain neutral, to remain independent and above the political fray. And, there are three very easy ones. I'm not sure if there was a meeting, I suspect there wasn't, between the Inspector General and his team and the Independent Policing Oversight Authority to agree on how the monitoring would take place. I am not sure whether there was a meeting between the National Police Service and the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights, or even for a number of organizations like Amnesty International that have experience of organizing peaceful demonstrations that do lead to presentation of petitions and pickets. But I think at this point it's important to bring in some neutral, independent bodies that are specialized in this area to ensure that we don't see a further return to violence. And the very last one is just simply that we have to recognize that this is only a temporary solution. The more important issue is the political solution. This is really a tension between the political class that is being fueled by a sense of mass disillusionment with the cost of living. So therefore the political dialogue needs to start very quickly. And I think the first start is really to just unbundle all these issues. There are issues around the cost of living. What is the agreement around that? There are issues around electoral justice and not reconstituting the Electoral Commission in the absence of very big political formations. And then lastly, the issues around governance and the management. But I think for Kenya Kwanza, it is they're in a very, I think, Joshua, you mentioned that we're at a crossroads, but I think for Kenya Kwanza, they have to recognize that Kenyans are hurting. They are watching very carefully how their money is being spent, and that if there is any clear indication of wastage or corruption or controversial policy positions, that will further compound the situation and lead to more people swaying to the idea of protesting on issues and perhaps even without leadership. And there you're into a insurrectionist moment. And I think that's probably what the National Security Advisory Council and the council itself are fearing most, is that we actually have an insurrectional moment where you don't have leaders to talk to. It is very possible, as we've seen from other countries, to have a wave of discontent spill out into our streets and into our communities and into our villages, and actually you cannot identify a leader.
So what happens next? I mean, you have, the people who are at the very top of the leadership mantle who are taking a very hardline stance on how to go about this. Well, there have been calls of dialogue from civil society organizations like yourselves and also religious circles. But we have these two camps from the political divide that saying, no, we're not going to have this conversation, we're not sitting down. So what does this portend for the country?
Well, anybody who's older than 10 will know that our history is full of these moments. There's high tension, and then suddenly people are sitting around a table negotiating, and we have either an inter-party conversation or we have a much larger stakeholder conversation. So the political class has always been able to dialogue, and actually for many of us who have been outside of the political class, we sometimes have difficulty distinguishing different ideologies, different political perspectives, because in many ways they've been essentially through this rotating house of or this rotational space of political parties mutating every election. So I think it is possible for them to sit down, and actually let me just be predictive, they will sit down. The question is, how long will it take, and how many lives will we lose, and how much property will we lose, and what damage will that do to the economy?
All right, Joshua, dialogue, that's what everybody is calling for right now. Are you seeing that happening soon?
I may not project the accuracy of dialogue because of utterances by various politicians which are non-inspiring from the two sides. They don't inspire at all. But the bottom line is that the two factions are angling the conversations around the underprivileged and the vulnerable in society, the so-called hustlers. During the political campaigns, and I'll revisit the Kenya Kwanza manifesto, which they called the plan, and the president, then candidate for the UDA or the Kenya Kwanza Alliance, in his introductory remarks, and I think that is what is even putting us at more at cross, or rather at crossroads in our country, that we have 3 issues on the ballot, and how we choose will determine whether Kenya marches forward or backward. And the first one, he says, my first agenda is to defend our constitution. The current conversation is about deviation from implementation of the Constitution of Kenya. And I think the issues that are being raised here revolves around high cost of living, just because of disregard. I think when we were doing the newspaper review here, which are priorities here? Is it the vehicles for the top offices, or reducing the cost, addressing the issues around cost of living and heavy taxation that Kenyans are currently facing? And they were contrasting whatever they were saying from their predecessors, where they were saying they are putting us in absurdity. In fact, there is more absurdity now, even with a few months when they are in political office, than we saw those other 5 years. And I say that because they said Kenya should stop being a political battleground. It is now a battleground, that Kenya as an economy needs to be addressed. Currently, we look at that as an agenda that is not really on top priority as we speak, because they say the science of rains is the assembly of clouds that show that rain is going to come. But look at this, appointments of public office holders. Is it moving forward or backward? There were 23 CS, now we have more than 50. Look at that. When we look at the cohesion and integration of the country, is it backward or forward? When you look at the separation of powers, the executive arm of government, the parliament, and the judiciary, look at, the chemistry on those 3 arms, and even the county level governance. Where is the Council of Governors? Is it vibrant anymore as we used to see in those other dispensations, or it's even dormant? But the most important one in this manifesto of the Kenya Kwanza, they say that, and I have read it, the people are the greatest resource of our country. But as we speak, is that the resource that is being invested on? And even let me even digress to Kiswahili, where they say, kazi yetu sio kutengeneza nafasi ya kazi, nafasi ya kujiwekea mambo ya kupata nafasi ya kazi, lakini kutengeneza nafasi ya kazi kwa Kenya wengi. Look at that. But Kenyans, there is no poverty of information in our country because there is penetration of technology. People can go back to the internet. The internet never forgets. They look at all those speeches that was given, the promises that were made, compare with now. In fact, these demonstrations would not be there if Kenya Kwanza administration would have fulfilled their promises, which they made, that in 100 days, this is what we were going to do. And we can look at an audit of each and every of that, and you will see that there is a deficit.
But there has been an argument that for government that has just been in power for just 6 months, why can't you give this government a little bit more time to be able to implement some of these policies?
Zainab, that is an excuse. Let's ask ourselves, what changed from the provisions of this plan that Kenya will be a country that is being enjoyed by stakeholders? Now, the conversation has changed and it's become a country of shareholders. Where did we lose that? Does that need to take time to be seen that there is a trajectory that is positive for the development of our country? The signs are very clear there, and this is not in form of any attack, but it's just a genuine concern from an observation point of view that probably we can clearly see that the conversations is not taking us to the directions that we were promised as voters of this country, whether we voted for Azimio or we voted for Kenya Kwanza.
Diana, the right to protest is enshrined in the Constitution, like we've all mentioned, Article 37. This has also been tethered to Article 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But do you feel like we've embodied the spirit of the law with regards to everything that we're seeing? A lot of accusations from the politicians at this point, and at their very heart is a number of issues, at the very heart of Kenyans. The issue of the cost of living, the issue of appointments in government. How do we move? How do we move forward? Because they're saying we're not going to have a sit down, we're not going to have a dialogue, but we also need to resolve some of these issues. But at the same time, we have the right to protest. But when you do go to the streets to protest, it's not a very good scene. So what do we do?
Thanks, Zainab. And looking at the current scenario, at the heart of the political demonstrations led by Azimio is cost of living. But I think the biggest concern for Azimio is the constitution of the IEBC.
Right.
Commissioners.
And issues of electoral justice.
Electoral justice, right. Yes. Those are the main interest for the Azimio leadership, but the whole country is definitely suffering. Ultimately, for us to make progress, we must dialogue and lay down mechanism for how we heal our country politically, socially, and economically. Definitely that will not, the protest cannot be the end in themselves. They are laying the ground, like Irungo has said. Ultimately, we must have a political conversation. I do not think that the route that we saw on Monday is the most appropriate one based on where we are. And I organize protest, I support freedom of assembly, but I always struggle when people with constitutional mandate to take certain actions do not use their respective mandates and instead opt to protest. So for instance, when you see elected legislators, members of parliament and the Senate, resulting to largely a protest for cost of living, when within parliament they do have mechanisms for ensuring that we have a budget that is responsive to the current scenarios, then I worry about that. The electoral justice there, Azimio can lead us in the street, but when it comes to cost of living, I think we need to combine the protest with clear mechanism of what is ailing us. 2 weeks ago, I was in a dialogue where members of parliament from both sides agreed for us to deal not just with the debt, with the issue of pending bills. These are bills owed to people who have supplied government. There must be a political conversation for us to get the way forward. And by a political conversation, they mean the leadership of both sides, Kenya Kwanza, Azimio, county government, and so on. That is just one section. Where our economy is, the taxation process, ultimately, we need to sit down and have a dialogue. Based on the extreme positions that have been taken by the two political leaders, I think this is an opportunity for us, civil society and religious leaders, to lead in providing solutions. So, for instance, in this particular year, the very first year of Kenya Kwanza, where they will have a budget that they have developed that will be approved by a CS appointed by Kenya Kwanza, we must lead in providing solution for how do we reduce the fiscal deficit, how do we ensure that we are not increasing taxes currently, critique the current plans, then provide solution and open a dialogue where we bring everybody on board. So I think in terms of moving forward, it is a time for alternative voices, particularly civil society and religious leaders, to provide the needed leadership and bring the two leaders together. Then ultimately we can have a dialogue, because in the Monday protests, unfortunately, because of how it was organized, it was not very clear, the demands that were being made and the proposed solutions. Those will come if we have a sit down, and I think as members of civil society, we understand them, we can engage the people and then bring the political leadership on the table to discuss solutions.
All right. And one other key issue that also came out from yesterday's statement by Raila Odinga Irungu is the issue of boycotting some products in the country. Unfortunately, one of those products is a section of the media. And you have a telecommunications company as well. I will not name them here. But what does this portend when you have, a leader who was quite an influence, in the country, making such statements, and especially within the media? This sort of looks like a way to undermine the freedom of the media. From where you sit, Amnesty International catering for all across the country and looking at the statements and accountability of political leaders as well. What does this portend for, the media and some of these companies where Kenyans are earning from?
So as consumers, we have the right to choose which products that we want to buy, which newspapers we want to read, which outlets and services we want to give our patronage to. So I think that is not, unconstitutional or illegal to essentially identify. And I do notice that the press have taken a decision not to mention the companies, and it may be futile because I think everybody knows the three institutions that were spoken about the other day. So just to push back to the media, it's like, I think censorship also sometimes doesn't help the situation.
Right.
But let me come back to this from a bit of a historical perspective. The history of protest is as old as Kenya,
right,
and it is global also. So from the Tunisias, the South Africas, the Nigerias, and so on, the idea of protest is very much part of a democratic or a nation looking for democratic roots. Last year was the 100th year, the 100th anniversary, the centenary of Mary Nyanjiru's protest outside the hotel, which I don't know if I can name because apparently we're not doing brands here. But
why are you censoring us?
Which is okay. Yeah,
the Norfolk
we'll
Hotel.
just say it right.
And Mary Nyanjiru was essentially protesting against the arrest of Harry Thuku. So it's been at least 100 years since Kenyans have protested on this issue. And, it was only the protests across North America, and particularly in the southern states of America, that led to civil rights for black people. Or in the case of Europe, it was the protests of women that led to the women having the right to vote and suffrage for women. So let's start by saying this is not a inhumane, alien concept. It is really something that is built in our DNA as a nation. The second thing is that, it's often said, I think it was Martin Luther King that said, protests are the riots of the unheard. That where people feel that they are not heard, they have no space to speak, they have no opportunity to give direction to their government, they will protest, and in some cases even that will deteriorate into a riot. At the moment, Azimio is only using two techniques of non-violent civil disobedience. There are over 198 methods of non-violent civil disobedience. A gentleman by the name of Gene Sharp, and I'm sure everybody is now Googling him ferociously, and let it be just said that I'm not suggesting that all 198 be deployed at this moment, but it's important to recognize that there are several ways that you can actually take action publicly. And Azimio has only picked on two of these, the boycott and the demonstration model.
Which falls rightly within their right.
It is captured within our constitutional Article 37. Let me turn to, I guess, the issue that is really at the heart of this is what can the state do about this season of discontent? And I think there are kind of 3 or 4 things that they could think about. The first is obviously, statements like Kenya is a company of shareholders, and the shareholders that matter at this moment are the ones that voted for us, doesn't help. Yeah. Only 6 million people voted for Kenya Kwanza. We have a nation of 56 million people. Communication strategy is critical. essentially any language at this time that inflames the situation does not help. The second one is really, we are in a period of austerity. People's homes, people's businesses are really collapsing under the cost of living. One of the things that has not been talked about enough, I think, is what happened to the hustlers on Monday. Many of them went home. They had no resources, or there was no wages or no daily fees that they were able to use to pay for the food that their children needed to eat that night. So many homes in urban centers went hungry on Monday. So I think the government has to think very carefully about how it also demonstrates austerity, right? Having these, flashing headlines of decisions that the cabinet administrative secretaries will continue in the face of financial hardship, I think is completely a non-starter for the public. But the second one is what's on our newspapers today, which is we are seeing a 2 billion allocation for, 802 million shillings allocation for vehicles for really just 3 positions in government: the presidency, the deputy presidency, and the chief minister. Now, that figure is 3 times what the deputy president received last year. Now, of course, the deputy president and the president were not on the same side last year, so we can expect that potentially they cut back the budget. But I think what we need to just juxtapose is 802 million for 3 offices versus 574 million for the entire police force. A number of police officers that reach about 100,000. And the question for me to ask is, how do you explain that even to the police officers that are being asked to come out now on Monday and on Thursday to police us? The third thing really is around inclusive language. I think what we have to see now is Kenya Kwanza looking for inclusive language that is essentially reaching out. One of the dangers of, one of the lessons from Jubilee administration was this siege, the siege mentality, where Jubilee kind of withdrew into itself and it said to hell with all the independent bodies and all the civil society bodies and so on. And what happened is they got encircled, they got entrapped, and they got isolated. And I think this could happen very easily with Kenya Kwanza. And then let me just raise just one more. I know I've gone on this a little bit, but I think the depoliticization of independent institutions is so important. One of the reasons why I think the country is, the country and the political class, the opposition political class, are so nervous and anxious at the moment is what we have seen in terms of parliamentary capture. The raiding of independents and opposition parliamentarians by Kenya Kwanza. You can look at, for example, what's happening in the media. There was an attempt, thankfully it has been stopped now by the courts, but there was an attempt to interfere with the selection and the appointment of the Media Council of Kenya board. So, media feels under siege. The National Police Service, if it is not allowed to be independent and to be able to make decisions that are based on law and order principles rather than instructions from above, they will also lose the confidence of the country as they begin to be seen as an appendage of the national police, of the executive. So I think depoliticization is really important. The country needs to also be able to breathe, because then what will happen is that the different political and social forces will begin to see that actually what we have really is a conversation around trade-offs. There is only a limited budget that is available. What should it be spent on? Who should make those decisions? Who should be held accountable for those decisions? That is what we need right now, is an opening up to allow for people to be involved in the very difficult decisions that are before Kenya Kwanza. And just to say that some of these decisions will not lead to impact immediately. Right? So we need also a level of patience and tolerance. But I think the hardening of the positions, that creates hardening on the other side, and it will lead to more mayhem and more violence. It's predictable.
You say depoliticization. Joshua, do you feel that the politicians have sort of saturated the conversation in the country in a way that, Kenyans don't have that opportunity to sort of agree on a way forward?
In a democracy, the post-election period is not a period of division between election winners and election losers. Article 131 of the Constitution gives clear provisions on the authority of the president as a symbol of the national unity and the head of state, and all sorts of provisions that has been put there, and is very clear that the president has a duty to unite this country, give clarity on how this country needs to be led peacefully, and everybody to enjoy his or her rights, civil, political, and socio-economic rights, just to continue with their day-to-day lives without any disruptions. And even if there are demands that are made by any cadre of Kenyans, they must be accorded space or heard and responded to in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution.
Right.
But we are seeing currently a situation where there are liner positions between the divide. And this is very unfortunate that it has been trivialized in a way that you think that now there are those ones that are enjoying and there are those ones that are being made not to enjoy. But it's not a new thing in Kenya. In the previous dispensation, we had jargon such as sisi tunakula nyama na nyinyi amuko kwa meza ya kukula nini? Nyama. Now we are treated into the company shareholding as opposed to the stakeholding of the country. But I think the solution to this is for the government to communicate clearly on the agenda and the plan. There could be things that are probably ongoing and Kenyans are not aware. Probably will not even to address this. But the utterances of an excuse that we are only just few days in political office, we are yet to address this, yet in the plan it was very clear that these are our immediate addresses on the issues that are facing Kenyans. And then again, I think we've been put in a campaign mode during the post-election period as opposed to going to work. For me, I think the advice should be, let's stop politicking and work for Kenyans and deliver on the agenda that Kenyans were promised. And then again, on the issues of the heavy taxation, I think this was one of the promises that we will address these things. Let's lower the cost of living and communicate effectively on how we are generating revenue without necessarily having the underprivileged in society feel the heat of not affording the basic commodities. And I think this is not strange to Kenyans as we speak even here, because we have the junior secondary school education,
right,
which it was there in the former administration. And the unfortunate thing, as my brother Horton said, that, politicization of basic issues, such as the education, those comments that were made that when we come on board, and there is a politician in this country who is on record to say, tutaondoa CBC. But look at 7 years that our children have spent in school. How do you remove that? So it was very insensitive. And now
on that point, let me ask you, do you think we have an issue, a problem when it comes to communication? I mentioned something, a press statement that was released yesterday by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was embedded on their Twitter handle. I could not be able to pull it here on my screen, but I'm just going to state some of the paragraphs here. So it says the Ministry of Foreign and Diaspora Affairs of the Republic of Kenya presents its compliments to all diplomatic missions, UN agencies and international organizations, and has the honor to inform as follows. On or about the 13th of March, Raila Amolo Odinga, the opposition leader, called for nationwide protests whose central purport included having his supporters march to the seat of Kenya's presidency, State House, to oust the constitutionally elected president of the Republic of Kenya and cause himself installed as president. The ministry further wishes to inform that in spite of failing to adhere to the law today, that's the 20th of March, Odinga mobilized his supporters to execute his intention. And he goes on to say, security officers prevented the demonstrators from accessing the Central Business District and State House due to the egregious and highly provocative nature of the demonstrations, but also on account of the failure by the organizers to furnish a notification containing the specific details of the protest. Now, when you're looking at such kind of a statement, this is a statement that has been released and sent to, diplomatic missions and, international organizations that are already based here in the country. What do you think of that? Because from what we know, from the statements that have been made by the opposition, I don't think there's a point where we've been able to hear the opposition state that they want to evict anyone from office, especially more so an constitutionally elected leader or a constitutional office holder. So what does this portend when it comes to such kind of communication coming from, you know, a government ministry?
Yeah, Zainab, we are in an era where disinformation and misinformation has really reigned our democratic space. And even in preparations for these protests, we saw in the media, especially social media, on messaging around that people will be mobilized to escort Baba to State House and occupy the seat. I mean, there were such kind of statements. Whether accurate or inaccurate in terms of sources, but look at the kind of the response that came from the state, the one that we've just read. It is just an affirmation that probably that is what they believed to be authentic and authoritative message that was put in social media out there. But I think also we have also to be very responsible, whether as citizenry or as office holders in government, to interrogate various pieces of information before even we make public communication, because it has a net effect of how people image our country or how people posture what is going on in our country. Zainab, we saw photos from Congo circulating during the protests. I mean, those were people were beaten outside our country. We also saw photos of the post-election violence in 2007, 2008 circulating, you know, during the Monday protest. So I think we are in an environment where there is some level of responsibility, laws of legitimacy in terms of restraint in observing the online code of conduct as a personal responsibility. Before you share a photo or a video, you ask yourself, what will this portray, first of all, to the people I'm sending this message, or even the citizens of our country. But for me, I think one of the deficits of the current administration is public communication, management of public communication, and especially during crisis, what is called crisis communication, so that Kenyans are able to get clarity on what is going on. And you can see if there is an absence of public communication from the authorities, I mean, people will go to social media and portray all sorts of messages, and Kenyans, you know, from all walks, whether in rural or in urban, will use that as the gospel truth. And nowadays you cannot restrain the penetration of social media. Even when we saw the rallies in Mathare, in Isli and all that, I mean, it was live in Facebook, it was updates were there in Twitter, and nowadays even Twitter handles of various state officers has even become sources of information. So I think that is an area that we need also to invest in, both as citizenry and people who are office holders in government, to ensure that people get the right information. And then the last bit because I think I was making a very important point on this junior secondary education. And let me give the example, and I think this is a result of a lapse in communication. When a cabinet secretary in charge of education comes in public domain through official communication to say 200,000 children did not transition to grade 7 or junior secondary school. Remember, these are children aged 10, 11. So you ask yourself, for a responsible government, where are these children? And now we have a system in Ministry of Education which is called the NEMIS, where a child, records is known by the government. The school where they are, the kind of the progress they are making in their access to education, and the facilitation by the state in the subsidy that is given to every child. Again, the government comes on board to say for every junior secondary school student in grade 7 will get 15,000 Kenya shillings. And there will be recruitment of 30,000 teachers who will be sent to the junior secondary schools, one per school, and there will be additional ones that will follow. And then again, there's change of school uniform. I mean, parents were not prepared with all this kind of information. But again, on the 30th of January this year, children in grade 7 reported to their new classes. But I think as we speak now, they have never gotten all these resources that were promised by the government, including the deployment of the teachers. So as parents, we ask ourselves, are our children for a pilot test? How is their future life in terms of academia look like? How will these children be? So those are questions, and of course this also informs the part of the grievances of the protesters.
Okay. Let's see.
Yes, I just want to jump in because I think Joshua makes a very important point about disinformation and misinformation. In the 6 weeks just before the elections, we saw a spike in hate speech and malicious content on many of the social media platforms. 40% was the figure, and the Council for Social Responsible Media has captured this very powerfully, I think, and also Creco. I think you did a bit of work on this work. There are now resources within the civil society that are not being tapped into. Fumbua does fact-checking real time. Code for Africa does an Influence do this work full time. What we need is really I guess an opportunity for those institutions to be tasked with essentially dealing with the fact checking, because I think in many ways the disinformation is almost as dangerous as what you see on the ground. You can throw stones by tweeting. You can throw stones by, or missiles. You can project missiles by posting. And I think what's really important is that we need to see these institutions brought into the conversation, so that actually what we're dealing with is factual, it's evidence-based, and it's not exaggerated for the intention of just whipping people into mindless violence.
Right. Diana, let's go back to the issue of the communication, and have politicians and even government state officers who are making who would make statements perhaps to sort of whip emotions of Kenyans at this time. What would be the way to go about this?
I think that has been at the center of the crisis, and one, it is unfortunate that one of the government handles then took the position that all these protests were about coming to unseat the president from power, and that may inform some of the behavior that we saw from the police, because then if you're protecting the presidency of a president who has been sworn into office, then the stakes become much higher. But accountability would be at a different standard. Overall, even away from the protest and the ongoing discussions, we are currently in a crisis, a socio-economic crisis that also has political dynamics. And this being a government that is barely 6 months in office, they definitely keep imploring us to give them time. But time will only be given to the government if they are able to clearly communicate the plan that they have for Kenyans. And when they communicate that particular plan, it must be responsive to the current needs. The government needs to appoint. The last 2 weeks, they have released communication. One was around the appointment of CASs. This week, it has been around the cabinet memo for various economic reforms. The headline, as highlighted, is the privatization of public parastatals away from parliamentary scrutiny. So if you look at what is written by government, is it going to build confidence that they are addressing the current crisis? The government, and I think we are guided mainly by humanity, transparency, capability, and reliability of government. Is the government communicating empathy when we see these types of appointment? When austerity measures are communicated, but what is written in a budget is very different. You definitely don't build confidence, and what happens is new narratives must emerge. There's a vacuum because what is communicated is not what is delivered. So right now, all we need from government, if they have a reliable plan that responds to the needs of Kenyans who are starving, who are not able to afford education, who do not understand what education curriculum they are in, the future of their children, where public universities are defunded, health services are on the verge of collapse, our roads or infrastructure projects have to be hung somewhere.
Let me throw in a spanner. I mean, I'm still going back to that argument that you have a government, when they were taking over power, they said, look, we found a country that is in a deplorable state, economically speaking. There are so many things that were not working. We need to fix some of these things. And even when it comes to the issue of appointments, when a new government comes into place, they have a way of viewing things, a way of sort of planning on how to, manage its own administration. Isn't it prudent? Is it in their own right in making these appointments and working around, removing subsidies for some of the commodities in the country and putting subsidies in others, and just saying, this is how we want to run our government. So give us time and let us align our things in the way that they should be to be able to get sort of an effective or impactful outcome.
I do agree. When a government is appointed, they must lay out their plan. And I even move away from what they promised. Now they are in power. They have all the information, all the resources to rework. And part of it would be an acknowledgement, we promised to do this. But based on what we have found now that we are in government, this is the alternative. But that does not take away, for instance, the fact that we must remain within our national values. So one is to tell us openly, this is how much we owe as a country. This is how much was lost. This is to corruption. This is how we will pursue it. In the meantime, we must pay our debts, but this is how we will ensure these other services are resourced. That has not been communicated. We are just being told, wait. We are moving from consumption subsidies to production subsidies. Yet we do away with subsidies around power. Power is the main driver of production. So the plan has not been communicated. If that is communicated, Kenyans care deeply about this country and they will know this is a plan for good. And when a plan is presented by government, especially in a democracy like Kenya, the government must expect critique and feedback. But they have not presented that. Ultimately, that should be the priority of the government. It is the only way to do away with the disquiet. If they don't, alternatives must emerge, because people cannot live in pain and oppression forever. So yes, they need time, but that time must be utilized to communicate the plan consistently, and we will hold them to account. If it looks reliable and it is transparent enough, Kenyans will come on board. If not, then dissent must come into play.
All right. Yes, Irungu, then we take a very quick break.
I was just going to say that, obviously, and it's an obvious point, but Kenya Kwanza is currently in a change management moment, right? And they need to see this from a professional perspective rather than simply just going to the political lens all the time. And a change management process requires a couple of things. The first is a clear vision. The clear vision was the manifesto. It is what won them the election. The second thing is a clarity around how that vision is going to be actualized. And the third one is you have to carry people with you. Those three elements are probably the most important in the change management process. What is not helpful, and even if I can just break it down for some of your viewers that perhaps are not managing big, complex government institutions. If you had an intimate partner who spent all their time talking about your ex and saying that, I'm not like your ex, the ex was like this and so on, you would begin to worry about the nature of that relationship. If you got into a matatu, and many of your viewers potentially are in matatus right now, and the matatu driver is spending all his time looking in the rear view mirror and not through the windscreen, you probably would be advised to get out of that matatu because you are likely to have an accident. And I think this is the challenge that Kenya Kwanza has, which is to stop reverting back to historical analysis to explain the difficulties of management today. The difficulties of management today, as Diana has said, are really to do with where we are as a nation right now, where the economy is right now. And what's most important is really to start giving us some very bold, practical ideas that will deal with bringing down the wage bill, that will dealing with the waste that was there under Jubilee administration, that will deal with the corruption that was there. But I think what many of us are seeing, even in the all change mentality of let no parastatal, no government agency be left with its previous leadership, and you get this all change approach. And of course, the last bastion of this probably will be the ambassadors, that we're going to see a change of ambassadors, even for those that are hitting their KPIs or their performance targets. We are getting extremely worried that actually the primary preoccupation is really just filling seats rather than transforming the economy in the manner in which the manifesto was so clear.
All right. And when we come back, we will just be taking a look at perhaps what are some of the solutions that we need to now put on the table, at least for political class, to see what way forward for us as a country as well. Let's take a very quick break here on AM Live NTV. Talk to us. The hashtag, as always, is AM Live NTV. We're going to be back in a short while.
With Glovo, you have the city in your hands. Unatamani chakula different? Order Glovo ujaribu restaurant mpya. Diapers zimeisha? Order Glovo and save the day. Download the app and order anything you want.
To get Sala Zangu by Ilagosa wa Ilagosa, dial star 812 star 832 hash. Skiza na Nation.
This Sunday on Property Focus, never been seen before Viv Suite collection. It's making rounds and we're about to find out why. This Viv Suite collection is absolutely magnificent, and find out a little bit more about the pricing, the quality, the durability. This Sunday on Property Focus at 5:30 p.m. only on NTV.
What is it?
Anna and her sister got into an accident. They're now at the Cherkasy Regional Hospital.
Yana, give me the ring now! No, I don't want to. I'm in the hospital. Where's Anna? What happened? Is she dead?
Yana, you don't recognize me?
I'm Anna.
I don't understand anything. It's a mistake.
That moment when you start to get back to ordinary, and ordinary feels amazing. Whatever pain you're going through, release starts here.
All right, welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. I beg your pardon if you got that sound. You're watching AM Live on NTV. Now, as we take a look at the history of, the history of civil disobedience in the country, like Irungu had mentioned, it dates back to, pre-independence, and then we had, clamor for multi-party democracy. And we did see, and we've witnessed a lot of this, protests and demonstrations for many years, many decades. Now, Irungu, when you look at these issues that, Azimio is putting forth, do you think it resonates with the common mwananchi? Or is it just, because according to some, this is just for political expediency? Does it resonate with the common mwananchi?
So I think, you know, the answer to that question is not in my opinion, it is what we saw on Monday.
Right.
I think even the National Police Service and the National Intelligence and possibly the National Security Advisory Council were caught unawares by how virulent those the response would be. I think if they had known that was going to happen, perhaps a different strategy would have been to agree on where the demonstration, the protest would take place. And I think KICC, of course, is in the heart of the city, and therefore there are a lot of logistical nightmares for the National Police Service to manage in a case like that. I mean, there's a lot of business that is involved there. There's a lot of transportation that is required. Of course, the good governor potentially lost a few gray hairs as he watched this unfold outside his window. But, you know, I think there are strategies that they can deploy. For example, we have a lot of public spaces. Unfortunately, Uhuru Park, which Freedom Corner, which has been the main focus for many protesters for years, really. You know, I mean, the whole of the 90s, the 80s, and the 90s. You know, freedom was waged in that corner, in that very spot where Wangari Maathai and the mothers of political prisoners stripped naked. In many ways, I think, you know, we do need spaces where people can ventilate their concerns. They can be orderly. The marshals can essentially manage those processes. And I think one of the things that we have to remind both the politicians. So I saw Honorable Chungwa yesterday saying that they need to arrest Raila Odinga. And in some ways, it's going to be a non-starter, unfortunately, because you know, our laws are fairly clear. You have to have a charge to be able to prosecute people. So unless it's just vexatious, you know, arrests, like we saw in the case of, you know, the former Cabinet Secretary Matiang'i.
Right.
What we now need to see is really some clarity in terms of what is actually happening. So let me just give you one example, and I hope it will not be misconstrued as calling for protesters. But I think there is a distinction between looters and protesters.
Right.
Looters are essentially, you know, people who take advantage of, you know, the right to assemble, to essentially destroy property, to steal from others, and it's unacceptable under our laws.
So then how does...
You manage that not by challenging the protest, the assembly. You manage it using existing laws that deal with assault, robbery with violence, and robbery. That is those are the charges that you prefer against looters. But to try and lump them all together and say that somehow the organizer of the picketing or the demonstration is responsible for the looting will just not go through our courts successfully. So I think what we have to do is we have to see the National Police Service beginning to identify, you know, who are the looters, who are the people that come to destroy even the protesters. And it is not, you know, it's not unheard of in our history that actually, you know, there have been cases where the opposition of the people organizing the rallies actually sponsor violent people to come and destroy the demonstration. And I think we have to make sure in the coming weeks that this is not possible.
Let me ask you this.
Sure.
We're talking about civil disobedience. In my understanding, civil will be in a structured manner,
yes,
in a conducive environment. But when we're looking at what Azimio is doing right now, because the chaos witnessed in just day one of their protests, would you consider that civil disobedience, or do we have another term for that?
Yeah. So non-violent civil disobedience is actually I guess it is a strategy that has been perfected over hundreds of years. I mean, it's not something that we need to reinvent now, but it is essentially based on the idea that what you're doing is lawful, or if you are challenging an unjust law, you are essentially bringing public protest to a space in which there is no violence, right? So that's the concept. Now, for that to happen, there has to be two levels of, I guess, two levels of maturity. First, on the side of the authorities. The authorities have to, as per the law, facilitate, promote, protect the protester, and also provide the conditions for the protest to take place without violence. Right? We have intelligence officers. We have, and they were there, I'm sure, on Monday. There were a number of plainclothes officers who will be able to identify what is legitimate protest activity and what is, you know, opportunists essentially coming to loot or to create violent activity. And I think that's what we need to see more of. But, you know, it is not the interest of Azimio to loot, I would assume, let me not speak for them.
Right.
In fact, I'm seeing tweets that are saying that we are perhaps, too gentle on them. But I think what we have to, maybe I can rephrase that just in the context of that tweet, we have to see Azimio take leadership to ensure that their protests and their demonstrations are run by marshals, that there is a clear agreement with the authorities on the routes that are being taken, that those routes are away from children, they're away from businesses, and they are essentially legitimate political activity. So the location, as I kept mentioning, is so important. But when you deny a protest, what you do is you send that process, which is constitutionally guaranteed, into chaos. So the point at which things started, I think as Chinua Achebe would say, the late Chinua Achebe, the point at which the rain began to beat us was not on Monday morning. It was on the days from Friday, that whole weekend, when there was actually no agreement that was reached. And, for example, the arrests of students who simply were expressing their view at Chester House, and essentially having them stay the night, 2 nights in CBD prison, and being brought to a court of law, which in many cases, that case will probably collapse, right? So I think the key thing here is not to look at the violence. The violence is just a symptom. The question is, what was the cause of the violence? The cause of the violence was a lack of agreement on non-violent civil disobedience and the right to dissent.
All right, and having the police, it was prudent that the police create an environment for people to picket peacefully.
Yeah.
So that's one of the issues as well. Joshua, maybe as you make your final remarks, I want to ask you this question because it is something that has continuously come out. It's the issue of, civil society organizations and the space that they have in the country right now. I mean, the collective power of civil society in Kenya is, and across the world, is quite underestimated. You cannot underestimate it. But when we're looking at civil society organizations right now, they've been accused of taking a back seat. And, that's where we have an environment where the political class are taking, positions and saying, look, we're protesting on the issue of the cost of living. Back then, 11 years ago, I saw, a news where, it was the civil society organizations that were at the forefront of fighting for, Kenyans on the issue of the cost of living specifically. Do you think that we need to improve? Why do you think that's an unfair assessment?
Zainab, I think they perceive the observation that civil society is dormant is incorrect. It's also part of the disinformation agenda. We are aware on how we have been in the past called the evil society, busybodies, people who use spaces to drive foreign agenda and all these things. It's part of the disinformation. And I think we've never been combative enough to say the way politicians do, to say that is, falsehoods and whatever, something like that, because we are busy. But what many Kenyans have been confused, even currently as these protests continue, is that during the handshake period, corruption used to be there, high cost of living used to be there, cost of fuel used to be there, natural calamities such as drought, COVID-19 used to be there, all these things that even are manifesting now. And the people who are in the handshake never said anything. They were never active as it is now. And people are questioning why now? Why now in the route of administration when they are not in government? And you can see on how that agenda has been trivialized, that these people are position holder seekers to join government. They will not want to play their role. But that is a conversation that should not make us lose the agenda of what is affecting Kenyans. Because even during that period, the people who gave a voice of reason for this country to say, for instance, BBI was not constitutional, who went to court under the Linda Katiba initiative, and it's civil society. It's not to appear in the streets, is when you want now to say that that is civil society that is active at work. There are so many strategies. They are there's lobbying, there's advocacy, there's public interest litigation, there's engagement of constitutional commissions, there's monitoring and observation of different public affairs, including elections.
Right.
We are all observers here. I mean, and we were all active right from the polling station, the tallying centers, at the constituency level, the county level, and the national tallying center. And we gave our reports as civil society. But what Kenyans need to appreciate is that we've spoken on various issues, even as currently as it is, things that are unconstitutional, and championing pro-people governance and constitutionalism. And we've called to order some of the top politicians in this country. If you've heard of media control, where people would, I mean, especially people who hold very strategic positions in parliament, to say that the media needs to be controlled. But we are saying, no, that's not the democracy that we want. That is not what the Constitution of Kenya 2010 is all about. We've had also an agenda being pushed in the past weeks on a one-party Kenya. And that is what we saw before 1991. I mean, and civil society championed for the opening of the democratic space. And we called to order to say that is not a conversation that is very healthy in this nation, because our democracy is expanding, is not shrinking, and they will not have space as long as we are there in the human rights space, the democracy and governance space, in the civil society sector. And then I think the other important thing is that even as people talk about civil society focusing on the rights of the citizens, we also focus on the rights of the duty bearers, such as the police. We've asked the government that the police were promised in 100 days that their welfare will be looked at. We are aware that there is the Maraka task force. The report has not come. There was an extension of tenure, and it is almost expiring. We are looking forward to that report. And you can see even the police, who are also players in terms of restoration of law and order, as we even ask them to play their dutiful role as provided by the different laws, legal regimes in our country, so that Kenya can be a peaceful country. And then the last bit is the unconstitutionality of some of the actions. In the constitution, Kenya is a presidential system, but we are seeing an indirect championing of an hybrid system, whereby there is even an amendment of standing orders to have cabinet secretaries appear before parliament. That's not the case. We saw it happening, and we are going to challenge that. We've also seen where the CSS would want to have the sole role of privatization of parastatals, without the oversight role of members of parliament. And I think there was a tweet by NTV.
No, in fact, we have it on the Daily Nation.
Yes, and for us, we've flagged up that as unconstitutional, and we are saying that can never be allowed in our country. And that is the role of civil society in terms of also...
So we are going to see more from civil society?
More. Yes.
All right. Let me get Diana, then Irungu very quickly. Your final remarks, Diana, moving forward, and especially also on the civil society. Waning influence?
I think we are very influential. Look at us, 3 of us here on a morning show. I know we are on other shows. We are with the people. And I think what has happened is the context we operate in has significantly shifted. We are more in the digital media. We're in a presidential system of government. So our engagement are largely where...
The dynamics have changed.
The dynamics
have changed. And now things are different.
But civil society remains as committed, if not more committed. It has grown. There are more civil society organizations than there were before, that are more targeted on various issues.
All right.
And I think in addition to what we've done previously, you're going to see a very, very strong civil society in the coming days as we go back to the people's needs and interests, which we believe are best championed by civil society. But allow me to just go back to statements that have been made that, look, if lives must be lost, if blood must be shed for us to finally get to a true freedom, so be it. And
we have 30 seconds, then we get...
Okay, something I will seek your indulgence, because I think they really took my my time.
Joshua must have taken all the time.
All the time, but allow me to make these 3 points.
Okay.
One, the fact we cannot allow those statements to continue because when the context changes, we are no longer in the space of guerrilla where we have to go to the forest or Nyayo torture chambers. And whenever we have had protests where lives have been lost, dignity has been lost through sexual violence, the organizers of those protests do not go back to help those people heal. They are left at that. It will be the burial and it ends there. But families are completely broken for a long time. So as people organize protests, which I do, they have a duty to ensure that we protect people and lives at all costs. And whatever steps they must take with the state as the organizers, they must take them moving forward. So as Azimio does that, that will be very, very useful. Then secondly, the very last one is what needs to be done on the basis of where we are as an economy. Kenya Kwanza government and all our legislators, can our budget be based on actual tax collected, not projection, not borrowing? Just give us a budget and priorities that are based on our current tax collection. We know where we are. If you're about to be auctioned, your parents call you and tell you, now we will be taking sugarless tea.
All right.
Okay, and we all adjust. It is that moment for us as a country to adjust and stick to what we have currently based on our tax.
All right, Irungu, 30 seconds.
Very quickly, I think, most Kenyans think that civil society is NGOs. It's not. It is the full spectrum of health workers, journalists, accountants, border riders, hustlers, and so on. So I think we have to look at it in a very holistic way. But organized civil society continues to be extremely influential, not just on the issues of the famine and food security, issues of education and CBC, budget oversight, the work that TISA and others do. Two-thirds gender parity, gender equality has been an issue that NGOs continue to push on. Extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances, these are issues that NGOs are pushing. I think there are a couple of things that I would leave as parting thoughts. The first is that increasingly I'm hearing and I'm also experiencing difficulties of getting meetings with senior government officers. It seems like they're too busy, they're not disinterested in engagement, and I think what we learned from the Jubilee administration is you do that at your risk. The second is the Public Benefits Organizations Act. It was a promise of the Kenya Kwanza manifesto. We have seen no movement on it, and unfortunately it is the beginnings of a collaborative and policy-based conversation between government and civil society, and without it we are still in legal limbo.
I suggest that soon we should have a conversation just to sit down and look at the space of civil society in Kenya moving forward, some of the challenges and how to go about that. But thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Diana Gishengo, National Coordinator, TISA Kenya, that's the Institute of Social Accountability. Joshua Changwonyi, the Executive Director, CRECO Kenya, that's Constitution and Reform Education Consortium, and Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. And we will continue to monitor the developments with regard to the mass action calls by the opposition, and we'll be bringing you more details on the same. Thank you for watching. This was M Live. My name is Zenab Ismail. See you tomorrow. Have yourself a good day, and Your World is coming up shortly with Winnie Lubendo.